Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm a professor in the Department of Lab Medicine and Pathology, and I am very pleased to see you and very happy to welcome Dr. Linny Golightly here to give today's Gottfried Schmer Memorial Lecture. And before I introduce Dr. Golightly, I'd just like to take a minute and remember Dr. Schmer, who was an emeritus professor in our department and played a really big role as a mentor and a friend for many of us. And he had a very interesting career where he worked on coagulation and von Willebrand's factor and other things. And then when he retired, he started a whole nother career. So you can always reinvent yourself. He trained in Austria in the 50s and 60s and then spent decades here at the University of Washington, as I said, looking at von Willebrand's factor and factor VIII. But then when he retired, he got a master's of public health and tropical medicine at Tulane and spent a lot of time in South America with his wife, Elizabeth, caring for patients and taking his knowledge back here to teach about global health and parasitology. And on the left is a picture of him in Brazil, and on the right is a picture of him, as many of us remember him sharing his gifts with us in the microbiology lab. And so I'm grateful to the Schmer family and to his son, Peter, who passed away a few years ago, who helped commemorate this lecture. And then I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Linny Golightly. This is the fourth Schmer lecture, but in fact, this is only the second Schmer lecture where we've had an actual person here because COVID led us to have several remote lectures. So first of all, I'm very grateful that you came here. Dr. Golightly is an associate professor of medicine, microbiology, and immunology at Weill Cornell Medical School. She went to Wayne State University and then did her medical degree at Cornell. She trained largely kind of in the Northeast and, amongst other things, did her fellowship in infectious diseases at Harvard, and then has most recently been at Cornell in a variety of different roles. She as an infectious disease doctor, provides clinical care and has had interest in severe malaria and diagnostics, especially like point-of-care diagnostics, but has also worked extensively in low and middle income countries, both looking at medical issues and also looking at how we improve diversity and inclusion in training and retain people in medicine, both from those countries and from the US. In that light, she is currently the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Weill Cornell, and she is also notably the president of the society that I am a member of, the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. So we're very grateful to have you here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm glad to be here in person. And for those of you that are here in person, thank you for being here. And for those of you that are online, I'm glad that you're able to be here in pixelated form. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank everyone that I was able to meet today. And if I didn't get to meet you and you'd like to have some sort of conversation or discussion after this talk, please do feel to reach out to me. I'll say that here in advance. And I will say that my remarks will not be too long because I'm hoping that we will be able to have some time for discussion. The topic, colonialism, the lingering effects of the past in the present, I've taken a few liberties with how I'm going to give this lecture. But you know, I do have a few gray hairs these days. They were well earned. So I will begin by saying I have nothing to disclose except a deep passion for what I'm going to talk about, and a hope that we can all have an honest discussion that may be with some differences of opinion. So first, what is colonialism? I will provide the following definition, and we may differ on that over time as I go through this talk and as people reflect. But it's when one group of people moves into a land where there's another group of people and effectively takes over. Now, those other people may still be there, or they may not be there. And we're going to talk about the lingering effects of colonialism. And so, what do I mean by linger? A couple of definitions. There may be things that happened in the past, from colonial times, if we want to define that, may still affect us in the present, whether we're aware of them or not. And also that these lingering effects may affect us and others in ways that we may be aware of or not. And there's no harm in that. You don't know. But once you know, maybe you want to do something about that. So I'm going to warn you in advance that my father, this is my father, Cornelius Golightly, was a philosopher. And I would encounter him sometimes out at night in Detroit with our dog Mimi that he was walking. And I'd say, Dad, what you doing? And he'd say, I'm pondering the universe. So I ask you to ponder both near and far. We're going to get pretty small and we're going to get pretty big. The universe. What is colonialism? Can we linger? Can we think? What are the effects? Well, I would like to say that I borrowed this statement, University of Washington, land acknowledgement. The Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. That's where we are now. Do we have anyone here of indigenous descent? Aha, we do. And I would say that I come from New York City, which is the traditional lands of the Lenape people. So we begin our story with this acknowledgement with colonialism, right? This is a land where other people were. Now, I wasn't here then. I think many people here weren't here then. So I'm not technically responsible for it, but I'm standing on that land that belonged to somebody else. So that effectively is colonialism. And how might that affect us? Well, I had the pleasure earlier this year of addressing what, here it says the class of 2027. We call it the mighty class of whatever, 2027, in their white coat ceremony, where you get your little white coat, and that's the beginning of your career of training and to be a physician. And I guess one of the questions I found myself reflecting on, and I've reflected on in some time in the last couple of years, is what do we learn on that journey when you get your coat, or if you're a PhD, or if you're an undergrad, or whatever. Wherever you are in your training, young and old, Dr. Schmer certainly showed us by his example that you can begin a new career when you're older. What do we learn? And do we think about other kinds of wisdom? Because of course, as a medical student, I should say I was a Cornell University medical student, I, like them, learned certain things from certain paradigms. We recently had Dr. Cash Ahinachu, and I apologize for any mispronunciation of his name, speak at Weill Medical College. And he talked about indigenous theories on health and well-being, and how in their traditions they go beyond the individual. And as a scholar from Canada, he said how they emphasize the community rather than the individual. A community that includes human and non-human life and their environment, how either healthy or sick relationships between humans and the ecosystems we inhabit impacted our physical and mental health. Now that's not something, at least when I graduated, we talked about much. But I think if we look at what are the consequences of colonialism, we might say that one of the consequences was not to think about life and health that way. And maybe some of the things that are going on, I'm originally from the Midwest, as was mentioned, a few tornadoes and things, some fires out here, things like that, that maybe if we look at that total health, the health of the community, of including animals, people, and the land, might change how we look at things. And indeed, it's not just that sense of overall well-being that makes a difference, but one of the things that some of you are aware of is what we're taught renders how we're able to see if there is pathology or not pathology. And I am not a dermatologist. Do I have any dermatologists out there? I know I have a few pathologists. And that many things are diagnosed or not diagnosed depending upon how you see them, the frame through which you look. And so that one of the issues in dermatology is that things may look different on pale skin versus dark skin, or white skin versus black skin. As an Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, I hadn't been in the job long before some students came in very upset. Very upset. Our curriculum was racist because they had a day where they talked about pathology on skin of color. Now, it turned out that had come up because in a previous class, that was what was requested. So as we go forward, as we think about how do we rectify something that may have had a problem in the past, how do we do that? Are we going to change? Are we going to move on? And where does that come from? Well, some of you may know and recall that we celebrated or thought about or acknowledged the 400 years that had passed since the first people of African descent were brought here as enslaved people. And so that's not exactly colonialism, but if you were an enslaved person, you were a product of colonialism. So again, we go back, there were the Native American lands, people from Africa came, and then they were here along with the settlers. So where do we fit in? I happen to have had a fellowship, which I won't give the name of because the conversations are private afterwards, but they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, arguing about these things. Who is a colonist? If you came much later, and I'm sure many people here are not originally from the people who came here, what does that mean? And what are the consequences? What are the long consequences even after the Civil War? And these shows encampments with slaves that were freed had nowhere to go. And these were really areas where the military were and where they could go, and they were contraband. And there were areas where you had a lot of smallpox and a lot of diseases and things which were not well characterized, those epidemics, because people didn't want to say, well, those people carry disease. So we don't even have the full history of what happened. And of course, after that, there were many other things that occurred we don't want to talk about. And as you know, there is a great debate now in this country about how much of our history are we going to talk about. And this is from one of the plantations where somebody was giving a tour and they said, listen, I just wanted to say that dragging all this slavery stuff up again is bringing down America. Does it bring us down or does it bring us up if we acknowledge what has happened in the past and how it might affect us in the present? Or does doing that lead us to things like this, the tragic murder of Mr. George Floyd, which led to worldwide indignation and a whole movement to try to do something about that? Maybe that looking at people as different, going back to those old times, brings us to an event like this, an event that still plays forward. Serena Williams, certainly a phenomenal tennis player, and you would think that someone at the top of her game in all ways would never have to say that she did not get the best of care when she was pregnant, because her complaints concerned that she had a pulmonary embolism and recognizing the symptoms were ignored. And she felt that they were ignored because she was black. And there, of course, is a lot of literature about that and how concordance, though it may seem incredible, that if your physician is black, it's more likely that you will get better health care. And Dr. Lisa Cooper, at Hopkins University, winner of a MacArthur Genius Prize, has done many studies looking at this and found that even children are ignored when they complain of pain. You can't make this up, but as I was preparing for this, I was speaking to a friend who is in Europe and has had a condition for 10 years, and she was finally able to get care, and for many years she was waiting in line to get care. She thought she was waiting in line. And so she was surprised when she finally went to get her surgery, and someone came in, she's black, all the physicians I'm going to speak of are white, if you will, to use that construct, and said, I must apologize to you. And she said, what for? She said, you've been sitting around all these years for nothing. And she says, what do you mean? She said, the doctor who supposedly put in the referral never put in the referral and left the country. And the second doctor said that because you're black, you were exaggerating your pain. Another doctor came in who she described as a little old white man who said, that's a quote from her, I am so, so sorry. This never should have happened, and I'm going to make sure it's reported. So something happened in the here and in the now. And how do we look at that? How do we think about that? How are different people now in this room thinking about that? So you have these things that occur because of feelings, if you were, racism, if you want to be blunt about it, that occurred. But are there other things that are at play when different things happen to people? So you may ignore what somebody says, but what about this race as an artificial construct? What about the concept that we may well be different, that people who are from a certain area of the world may have different genetic determinants, and we may be afraid to talk about them, much as they were afraid to talk about the problems of the outbreaks that were going on in those encampments after the Civil War. And so, as this would show, some would say that never offer genetic interpretations of race because such suppositions are not grounded in science. If race and genetics are being expressed jointly, painstakingly delineate the intended implication. And that's because, of course, one's genetics have been used against people, right? That there's certain things, the slant of the head or whatever, if not the color of the skin, that makes determinants about who and what one is capable of. But as the great Maya Angelou said, a poet, an actress, a musician, and an author, which one of us could know that years of bondage, brutalities, the mixture of our bloods, customs, and language had transformed us into an unrecognizable tribe? So that those of us in African descent in this country are different perhaps, but still have those same ties to things of those that are in Africa. And so can we look at that? And the answer would be, I think we must look at that. We must be able to make those distinctions to say that yes, some inquiries, some things that you say, black people have a higher tolerance of pain, so even today someone sits around without adequate care, or small children are ignored, that we must be able to look at what are the true genetic determinants that may in fact make up for different differences. Because there are differences, and I know there are many people in this room that are working hard to try to look at different determinants for health, and that trying to do specific care for individuals based upon their genome, based upon the specifics of their tumors, based upon the way they might specifically respond to an infection as an infectious disease person are very important. And there are ways to do that. And I would point to the incredible work of Melissa Benita Davis, who is actually now at Morehouse Medical College, and Dr. Lisa Newman, who is currently the head of breast surgery at Weill Cornell Medicine. And these two phenomenal women have been doing studies where they're looking at Duffy negative, something that occurs in people of African descent and has to do with whether you are able to get Plasmodium vivax or not, and they have associated that with triple negative breast cancer. And I know from my day and visit here that there are many experts here in breast oncology. And the story being that for many years you said that, well, women, black women with severe breast cancer, it's severe because they have not had access to health care. But in fact, many of them have genetic predispositions to have forms that are less easily treated by hormonal therapy, which we use in many women. And so that is one of the drivers for the more severe disease. But we will not know if we do not look, and we will not look if we do not think about it, if we're secure enough to think about it. And I think that having people such as Dr. Davis and Newman are very important, as are the many people in this room who are working to try to understand that. So that despite all of these things that have happened, Maya Angelou, and I paraphrase her just a little bit, it's always kind of hard when you take something from a poet, said, like dust, I'll rise, like air, I'll rise, up from a past that's rooted in pain, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. And so as we think about this, about colonialism and these lingering things in the present that might keep us from going into certain areas of inquiry, that might keep us from talking to each other, that might keep us from even getting an adequate history and working on it in our patients, that we think of that yes, that past is in our present. Now, many of you know I've been talking from the African American perspective. And I say that is kind of the perspective I come from, so I will forgive me that. But I will bring in some others, because actually, as you know, there were many others who were colonized. But indeed, in Africa, and this is the work of Helen Tilley and Medicine Empires and the Ethics in Colonial America, the whole continent, in effect, was colonized. And those systems led to unintended consequences there, which still persist. And I know that many people here, like I, are working in global health. And so that has led not only do we have issues in this country that are lingering, but how does that affect our work in global health? How does that affect our work when we're going to other cultures? And I think that everyone needs to double think when you look in the mirror. So I could look in the mirror and I could say, well, hey, I'm a black woman, I don't have any problems. Well, let's be a little honest with each other. Because I am, again, a product of colonialism. And my people have been here a long time. And so many things happen along the way. And so let's think about that. Because I raise that in particular, too, because some people will say, oh, I have nothing to do with that, nothing to do with that. But you've been in a milieu that derived from the things that happened here in the past, from patterns of behavior that were accepted in the past, and that have only changed when people stood up with the courage to say, you know, I don't think that's right. And so Warwick Anderson in his colonial pathologies, and it can be very difficult to read, you know, there were these intertwined histories of American tropical medicine and racial thought. So in this case, in the Philippines, the issues of hygiene. And I've told some of these stories before, but it's so basic, the dirty other. They get those exotic diseases because they're not really clean. And that came along with that. And so you need to clean them up. You need to clean up those spaces. We need to take them over. We need to colonize them. This concept that there's something bad or dirty or awful in their feces. Well, of course, if any one of us gets one of those parasites, we'll have the same problem. It's not specific to a person. And so I said we're going to each look each other in the eye, and I look myself in the eye, and I tell the story only because it's true. That I was in Ghana, where I work, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. And a lady was staying in the hotel, and she was the person who would check on the finances that the money sent to build the wells so people could have clean drinking water, that the wells had been built. And as many of you know, this is a major problem throughout the globe, that if you don't have clean water, that is also a proxy for many other parasitic infectious diseases and just overall good health. So clean water means many other things. And we talked back and forth about the importance of clean water, and she went out to see the wells, and I saw her that night at the little cafe in the hotel, and I said, "How are the wells?" And she said, "Oh, the wells were fine, but there were feces around." And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's just terrible." And I said, "Yes, we have a lot of things we have to do about hygiene. We really have to talk about that." And I called home. Now you will notice on the one side, we have where some people, maybe they're using the wells, and on the other side we have the lights of a beautiful city. And some of you know, as was mentioned, that I come from the great city of New York. Now I'm not going to say anything about Seattle or anyplace else, but everybody knows New York is the greatest place on the planet. And we do everything the best, big style. And I live in faculty housing on the Upper East Side. And so I called home, and they said, "Oh, I don't know how to tell you," my husband said, "but they caught our son and his good friend pooping in the bushes of the garden outside of faculty housing." Yeah. He wasn't in a lower middle income country. We can turn on the tap and drink the water any day. You can go buy all kinds of bottled water if you want to. But there's nothing specific about that. People do what they learn, what they find, what they're able to do, where they're able to do it. And we always have to think about that. And it's not only just in our own minds and in my mind, but remembering too how we think about other countries. You will notice here that this is the intersection of Selma and Martin Luther King. In this country, where they do not have sewage, and where, by the way, there's some questions about having hookworm. I don't know what you guys learned, but I learned we weren't supposed to have any hookworm here anymore, right? Didn't we get everybody's shoes and we did away with it? Well, maybe not. So we need to keep that in mind. So what do we need to do? This is Dr. Roger Glass, who is recently retired from being the head of the Fogarty Foundation. We need to decolonize our minds. We need to think about it. What are those vestiges that are left of us? And we need to look throughout the diaspora. And that begins in the mirror, and that begins here at home. Well, what's part of our home? Many people here I happen to know, like I get some funds from this place called the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest source of funding for medical research in the world. And that the Fogarty Foundation supplies money that promotes scientific research and training throughout the world. So the largest amount of money is coming from us, the United States. So where do I put our priorities? How do we make sure about that money? How do we, if I'm working with someone in Ghana, or you're working with somebody in Nigeria, or somebody's working with someone in China, or wherever, how are those monies dispersed? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Are we making sure that we're not taking all the credit? Maybe parachuting in is the term, and taking out the samples and leaving. Do we really have equitable relationships? Or are we mired in the past? So many of you will have seen this, and everybody's got a different take on it. Equality versus equity. If everything's equal, then you each get the same box and you stand up, and one poor guy's short or woman and can't see anything. Well, maybe you need to change so that everybody can see over it. But I learned things from my kids. This is the same kid, by the way, growing up a little bit, but don't you tell him I told you. But he's there, kind of big, and he wants to play football. Maybe let's not be at the fence. How do we get in the game? Aren't we in the game? We're in the game of healthcare, of science, of trying to change the world. And when we let people in the game, are they really able to play? We recently had Dr. Nugent speak from out here in California, and he made a statement that I liked. You know, a lot of people said, well, what is the data that diverse teams are better? And he said, what's the data that non-diverse teams were the best? Do we know that? I don't think so. That's just the way they were because you had colonizers and they were all of one group, right? So what is the best? Well, I don't know if this team is the best, but you may recognize I'm there. And there happen to be people there who are from the US. There's one person whose parents had recently come from Ghana. She had never been there. This is our research team. There's one young woman who left New York and decided to come out here somewhere sunny. And yet we all work together. And so as we work together, I have to ask myself, are we being fair to each other? Am I teaching the student who's here something different than the students there? Are we making assumptions? If they don't have the same background as the ones here, are we making sure they get the background? Isn't the highest form of racism or prejudice that you don't hold someone to the same standard as yourself to assume they can't? How hard are we working at that? It does take extra work. Or as Howard Thurman, who was the dean of the Rankin Chapel at Howard University and one of the people who mentored to Dr. Martin Luther King, in his Meditations of the Heart, talked about in the forest, how at the top at the tree lines, and by the way, I got a beautiful view of your mountains. I had to say that when I came in, I didn't realize those were mountains. I thought they were strange clouds. I thought, gee, those are some weird clouds and not the snow-capped mountains. But Dr. Thurman would say, is that if you go up, you get a point, and maybe some of you have been there, where some of the trees can't grow normally. They can't reach up because there's a real problem with the oxygen there. And so they skim the ground. But if they could, would they be high? And are we working with teams and with people where we're keeping them not able to stand tall? Are some of us holding ourselves in? Maybe even our colleagues. And of course, by now you might have guessed this has gone beyond race, ethnicity, sex, gender. Just how do we treat each other? And we do have a little data about all that. One of the faculty members who happened to be not of a diverse background sent me this. It was in Cell. Some of you will know that in 2011, there was a report that, shown here, that the number of NIH R01 funded people of color was low. And the question is that because you don't have opportunity? Is that because somebody's throwing you off the mountain? He told me, he said, Lenny, you gotta see this cartoon. Or again, because we're not helping people to grow where they are, or because there are disparities as you come along. I've shared with some of you, we've talked about having kids and how do you do that and how do you do your career and how do you juggle all those balls? How do we help each other as we go? Now, so there's colonialism. Maybe some of us might want to get out of that. Okay, I am not a colonialist. But then there's imperialism, okay? Where you reach in and you're doing things in somebody else's space, whether it's colonized or not. And I love this, this is Dr. Kamara Jones, who, by the way, I went to high school with. A lot of good things came out of Detroit in those years. I'm not talking about myself. But where she uses this theoretical framework, A Gardener's Tale. And I don't know how many are familiar with it, but she tells the story that she and her husband had just bought a new house, and they had some flower boxes. And so they planted flowers in both bunch of boxes. And a few weeks later, it turned out that the flowers in one of the boxes were doing absolutely stellarly. And the others were kind of pathetic looking. She said, gee, those are terrible flowers. Something wrong with those flowers. These other flowers are much better. You know, one set's white and one set's pink and blah, 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 blah. But it turns out that her husband, when he went to get the soil to plant the flowers, he put the enriched soil one place. But the other soil that had not been enriched was already there. And that was the reason. And maybe that's how we should think about it. And I come at it different ways because sometimes different things hit different people and hit me differently too. Who are we watering? Where are we putting the fertilizer? What kind of pot are we providing? Is there drainage or not? Do we put it in the sun or the shade? Do we think about what different people need? Again, going back to that issue of equity. How do we do that? How do we make sure about that? Now, I'm going to stop here at something that I only recently learned. I don't know about you guys, but I always forge ahead. But Someone who worked with me, who was not a doctor, who was not a PhD, was a staff person, introduced me to this about pausing, about that possibility, about thinking and considering, how it can interrupt old habits. It can do a lot of things. You can take a look. Stop inaction. Allow everyone else to catch up. Change the direction of a day or a lifetime. Restore sanity. A pause as a possibility. And sometimes when I'm thinking about things like this, or when something has hit me, and it may hit you, you witness something. You think, I should have said something. You hear something. Oh, I wish I wouldn't have heard that. Pause. It's okay if you paused. Just figure out how you're going to address it the next time, or how you're going to go back and try to make it right, or whether you're going to do something on the side. How are you going to do it? And so as we pause and we think about that, one of the things, for some of the things I've talked about, is how do we get from wherever we are to wherever we're going? And so, as I mentioned, the Fogarty Foundation, one of the things the Fogarty does, and I've talked to some people here today, is that there are programs such as the Launch Program, which I would encourage anybody here who's interested in global health to look into, which you can take a year and go abroad and work in another country in a mentored relationship, and that becomes a springboard for many people to enter global health. But as you will see here, the number of those from underrepresented backgrounds are very low. Now that could just be because the number overall of MDs and PhDs that you need in order to get up there, because that's a postdoctoral program, are low to begin with. And these are statistics which many of you are aware of already, and which again hew back to those prior times and many other social factors that have gone on since. So, but do we know what the cause is? Do we know what the problems are? Are there impediments? Are there things that are lingering in the present which also affect that? And so I've been part of a study funded by the Fogarty called EDGE, and I was mentioning to some people that I was just down at the Morehouse School of Medicine where we had a presentation of that, of these findings, of an ongoing study to try to understand what are the impediments for people going into careers in global health, and particularly looking at those that are not high in the numbers. And I would encourage anyone here who may be thinking about it, wondering about it, have some impediments of their own. That is an active code there, or you can use the link to take the survey. In our preliminary studies, we had first a qualitative part where we did some focus interviews, and then we came up with the online survey. Are things you might think. It does drive me kind of crazy sometimes when you have to study what you think you may already know. And they kind of cut across different demographics. That if no one in your family has a passport, maybe you're not going to go abroad for a year. If you've never traveled anywhere, if nobody you know has ever gone anywhere. If you don't have any money, that holds back a lot of us. What do we do in order to enable people to aspire and do things? I know at Weill Cornell we have tuition free. If you qualify, if you don't have the money, you can come to medical school and it'll be paid for. But what about those trips abroad? How many people don't go into research because they don't know? I had someone in my laboratory once, and she'd been there for a year, and I said, yeah, well, I'm looking for what we're doing in the summer. She said, oh, I can't work for you in the summer. I said, why not? She said, I'm going to the dry cleaner. I said, going to the what? She said, the dry cleaner. I said, why are you working in the dry cleaner? She said, because they're not giving me any money to work with you in the summer. I said, well, why didn't you say that? We can get some money. So again, things that you might not think about, but they're common things. But we're studying them, and then we're, again, we have a leadership from the NIH, and we are going to make more concrete evidence of what are the problems. And of course, we've had buy-in on that. So as I'm talking about that, and you're thinking about it, I hope you're thinking about what are the things that can permit us to reach out. Because again, it doesn't just affect the people here, but the people we're working with. And how many people here are actually in global health? Yeah, I've got a few. And even those that are here, I can tell just looking at the crowd, and I'm sure it's the same online. We have people here from many different backgrounds. I had the pleasure of meeting with their trainees and residents, and it was very impressive that we come from different backgrounds. So how do we work together when maybe the things that make up our globe, and for those in global health, if you go into a global health office, it's always got to have a picture of the globe or the map. Yeah, I see smiles because you do. But this is actually by Antonio Martorell, who is an acclaimed artist. And this medium is a bandillo lace. So it's lace that you make on your hand. You know, like the little girls, a lot of them, they have those little things. I don't know if you have those kids, and they'll make them kind of similar. I mean, bandillo lace is a little fancier, but you get the idea. But what I like about this what are the strands that tie us? The strands that pull us apart, or some of them need strengthening or thinking about them. And I'm sure some of you can come up with some I haven't thought of, and I'm going to put you to a pop quiz when I'm done to talk about things that we can do to try to enhance that. And I should say that this is in Puerto Rico, and that is actually a curtain on a stage. And maybe that's kind of where we are as we go through our stage of life. How are we going to work? We didn't start the colonialism, but it's lingering in our present. We didn't start we're not responsible for what happened, but we are for what is now. And I think of it sometimes as someone who didn't grow up with mandillo lace, but I did grow up with quilts. My grandmother would quilt things. And for those of you who know about the medium, you take patches of we would do it with things that were just left over, the rags, and you stitch them together. And this is one of them, an Underground Railroad sampler, as they say. And they're stories that the enslaved people would make these quilts with different symbols, and they'd hang up different ones if it was time to steal away. And the things that hold it together to make it warm or not warm. How do we make an environment welcoming? How do we make people feel that they belong? Are we doing things that make them not belong? One of the things that I've talked about a lot with different trainees is, you know, I feel alone here. People are around you, but I feel alone. I don't know how to communicate. I don't understand the rules. I didn't grow up in an environment like this. I'm a first generation. I don't know. How many brilliant minds do we lose because of that? And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up this gentleman, Dr. Jean-William Pop, who has worked for many, many years in terrible conditions in Haiti. He had an essay, this is from last year, about the crisis there, which, as you know, is ongoing. His son was kidnapped in November and held for many months and finally released, and he continues to struggle there. And so we have people who are working in all sorts of conditions all over the world and continue to fight, and yet many of the things that are going on in Haiti today go back to the beginning of that nation when slaves arose up and liberated themselves. So that man is Lucius Barker, and he was my godfather, and that baby is me. Now, I guarantee you, she didn't know nothing about none of this stuff. She was just a baby. But I'm here now. She didn't know that before she was born, people would look at her very differently. That they had to go to the Supreme Court to say that she could use the bathroom with the same place as other people, get in a swimming pool. She didn't know that even after those rulings that people put in all sorts of problems. She didn't know that people were going to march on Washington and still be striving for justice. No, she went about her life. Sometimes I wonder about the things my parents kept from me. And I, like someone else we discussed whose lectureship this is named after, went off to Brazil as a medical student. This is Três Braços, Bahia, Brazil, a place where actually many enslaved people started their journey here in the, quote, New World. And as I know other people in the audience have studied, I was studying mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. We were traipsing through the hills. You would take a car as far as you would go, and then a jeep, as they called it, a jeepy, and then we would walk up into the fazendas and look for the cutaneous lesions. And these are some of the maps that had been drawn by some of the other intrepid medical students before, and we'd go look for these little shacks and then try to look for what were the habitats around. And we were looking at cutaneous leishmaniasis, which as many as you know, and we were discussing today with some of you, can just be a sore that heals up. Sometimes they can be very ugly. And in a few people, they can turn into disfiguring lesions of the nose and in the pharynx. And that was a trip in my own journey from being that little baby to getting here, because this is Philip Marsden, who was a British expatriate who was in Brazil at the time. And at the end of that summer, he said, "My girl, I think this trip has changed your life." And he was right. Because in my own journey, I went from Três Braços. I spent some time in Haiti, where I give homage to Dr. Pop. and then ended up in Ghana, a place where, as we've mentioned, Maya Angelou spent some time. And at the University of Ghana, I've had the pleasure of working since 2004. I'm currently working with a team, so it's not only my DEI hat, but looking at developing a cerebral organoid, which is vascularized, in which we can look at microvascular repair. I work with a stellar team of individuals, both at Weill Cornell Medicine, that are experts in progenitor cell biology, as well as exosomes. And then I also work with a team at the University of Ghana and with collaborating hospitals. And as I mentioned, we're looking at repair. What makes for children with cerebral malaria, a disease which affects many children throughout the world? What makes some of them end up with recovering and they're perfectly healthy, and others have lingering effects, neurocognitive deficits in about 20% of the children. And so we're looking at developing these endothelial cells with these small organoids. We're looking at the signals in the exosomes, and then we're looking for whether we have healthy repair or not, and we're able to take the exosomes after we've looked at their proteomic payloads to try to see what similarities they have to other signatures that have been detected, and then we're able to put them within the organoid. And why do I go through all that? Because you see, that baby had a certain ontogeny, just like maybe those cells. We grow, we're influenced. Everybody here is influenced. You can ignore me. Some of you maybe already turn me off. That crazy lady, what's she talking about anyway? Has nothing to do with you. Or maybe it does. Maybe you'll look back. This is a view from Voyager, which some of you know is a little space probe that, if I get it right, could probably fit here. And yet looking back here, you'll see there's a tiny blue dot. Can you see it? That's us. That's Earth. We're all here together. Everything that ever was of the human beings is on that little blue dot. And so what does that mean? Well, the great theologian and author C.S. Lewis said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. I hope I've given you some food for thought how we might work together to change the ending. Because there's a heck of a lot of stuff going on, man. We got to do something. And to borrow from another tradition, there's a Ghanaian saying about a person with a machete. So the person who went before you is cutting the grass with the machete. Those colonizers, let's say. But we're behind. We can see where the grass is uneven. We can decide how we want to change, how we want to cut. Hey, we can forget that patch of grass and go somewhere else if we want to. But what are we going to do now? And the last thing I'll say about that is I like this about Dr. Schmer, because he was supposed to be done. He was supposed to be retired. He did his coagulation thing. He's famous. He worked with the kidney. He's done. But something made him say, I'm not done. I got more things to do. And we're here because of that. Because of that. Because of the afterthought. May we all have such afterthoughts now. And if you really want to think about afterthoughts, hey, like I said, I'm the president of ASTMH. Come on down to New Orleans this fall. It'll be great. We'll have a good time. You'll learn all about what Dr. Schmer was really interested in. And it'll be awesome. It's actually the largest international scientific organization of experts dedicated to reducing the worldwide burden of tropical infectious diseases and improving global health. We're working on these sorts of issues, but even if you don't come to New Orleans, I hope I've given you something to think about. I hope it keeps bothering in your mind. And I hope someday, if not maybe today, we can all start working on that stuff. And with that, I was told that I absolutely had to show you this slide, so I'm going to show it to you. And last thing, just so you know, I was told I had to stand in this little box. I never do that, but I did it just for you out of love. So thank you for having me. I would like and would be happy to answer any questions and any dialogue, conversation, whatever. Let's have it now. Thank you so much. Questions? Comments?
Well, I have
Yeah.
I'll start by thanking you, first of all. It's really thought-provoking and a good look back and a good look forward. I have a question about training and paying for training, right? Like where do we as the PIs find the money to pay for training? And one thing I've observed is in global health, we often want to train people who are coming from a place where there is like one of these diseases, they're interested in it, they want to come, but there's no great NIH mechanism. There is the Fogarty mechanism, but that doesn't, it's not the same as the mechanism we have like these Ruth Kirstensen and other things. So how do we balance that at the NIH? We need to train students from the U.S. We want to train students from abroad. If you were advising the NIH, like how do you kind of balance all those factors?
Oh, I complain. You can come join me. No, because as you know, for example, even with the launch program, they had more funds to bring people from abroad. And in fact, I had 2 postdoctoral fellows. They came for various periods of time here. They've actually now expanded that. So you can get, if you do on that year of the launch program, you can get some of the time here. But this is an issue. One of the things that I've done is I've started writing in when I do the grant, a kind of a training slot, and I'll call it that, to bring people over. It can be troublesome though, as you know. I had one person who couldn't come over for 9 months because they swore, U.S. State Department, that he was going to try to enter this country illegally. I said, he's got 4 kids. He's not coming here. And it was written in the grant, and I had gone to the embassy, and I said, the guy's got to come. It was holding up, and as you know, you have to have progress if you're going to get the next grant or get the paper or whatever. So it's problematic. But I think the more we talk about it, the more we speak up about it, and as the ASTMH president, I've been speaking up about it, and I ask you to join me with that. Because that's one of the other reasons we do studies like that, is to say what can we do to try to put things forward. But I think that the other thing that's been working against us to some degree is the spirit of kind of turning inside in the country and not recognizing the importance of turning out. I know from the things that were said here, and my kudos to you here in the lab that worked so hard doing COVID. It seems like you were doing what we were doing on the East Coast to try to have testing. Again, no pathogen is local. And so we have to look at what goes on abroad, and we have to think about it, and we have to train people, and we have to have partners in other places. And so I think we really need to be very clear on that, that we all have to work together. But, really good question. And the other thing is to fight for more training grants kind of across the board. I know even for our American trainees, even just in things like infectious diseases, we have problems with trying to meet the amount of money that people need to live in New York City so that you'll get a certain pay line. Even if for T32, I was our infectious disease program director for many years, and there's been just repeated issues with how do you get people the money that they need to live. So it's a problem and a challenge. Yes, question? Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. It's an amazing, lecture, and I personally learned a lot of it. I personally have, I think, around 3,000 questions, but I will try to shrink them into only 2 or 3. The first one is when it comes to genetic base or any actually database, as you know in the NIH, what we call the biased data sources. The GWAS, for example, has, I think, 90% of the genetic profile there is from Caucasian descent. The TCGA, I think it's around 80%. So the problem now, and this is how we actually build our evidence-based medicine now. This is how we do our business. So how actually to minimize this gap in the first place? With that said, if we are trying to go globally, the problem with this is, as you mentioned, preventing the parachute research of exploiting data out of different countries and present it here in an academic field. So there is a mistrust of the underrepresented population to actually fill these data sets. So it's this mismatch problem that we have from both sides. So how to address this from both sides?
Yeah, you need to be working with people in country and they need to have control of the data, and we also have to be scrupulously honest about what people are quote unquote signing away. I know in the work that I've done, as you know, you get IRB across, so we get Weill Cornell IRB, then in Ghana we have multiple levels of IRB, and then everything has to be reconciled. But I think that mistrust is unfortunately well earned. There are those that are working to get their own repositories, if you will, abroad, and they work with some people here, but it's a work in progress. I think that, as you know, even in this country, people's mistrust of the system and of what will be done with their genetic data is a real problem. And so I think it's something we have to keep working on and talking about, and that if we see anything that's not right, being sure that we call it out and that we raise that with our colleagues. I have had times when we were working on the IRB and I'd say, you know, I don't really think that's quite the wording we want to use, and I think we need to make sure that it's used within these certain confines. So I think you have to have this honest, open dialogue, and particularly when you're working with people abroad or in another culture, make sure that you talk through what are the implications. I was talking to somebody today, the way I usually think about it, if it was me or mine, would I be comfortable with that? And then try to get that done. But I think it is a problem when you're trying to get, you know, big numbers of people from populations for big studies. And I think that one of the slopes I've seen people, you know, you get something for one thing, well, maybe we should use it for something else. We could. And it's like, well, no, you can't. And then to make sure that you're just very, very scrupulous about that. But yeah, it's not a trivial question. You're right.
Sometimes, like, it's very hard to understand, as you were saying, like, what is totally culturally accepted for one population is actually totally very unaccepted or very, like, you know, considered very hurtful from different culture. With that said, the other question that I want to understand, how when we are trying to use this initiative, not just like, oh, we have good heart, let's do this, and all what we are doing is going there and reinvent the wheel and trying like new initiative and just like wasting more resources in new initiative that either we get a redundant data or will not do any help. So how to differentiate, or what is the strategy when we are doing an IRB over there, to use their current infrastructure instead of just like reinventing a new project that will not give us like the actual results that helpful for these population.
So I think you're saying you would go over there and do something that wouldn't really help, but is it adding to the literature? I'm trying to think of the scenario where I would go over there and do something that wasn't going to be really helpful.
My example is related to, maybe this is like personal experience in which like you get a grant, you try to do a certain project, however, you are not actually doing the correct penetration, if I can say so, where you just like wasting the resources and don't get the results because you have this maybe personal implicit bias that the current infrastructure over there is not working correctly and they have to reinvent the wheel somehow. So I feel there's like grants over and over and over that actually invested in different like countries that all what they do is like generating strategies in general, but don't do an actual effort.
So you're not getting out of the collaboration as much as you would want, despite trying.
I'm not penetrating the right population. I'm not reaching out for the right population in these countries. Definitely. So the cultural barrier is there.
I think it's if I'm getting it right, it's similar to here. Do you know what I mean? Who am I working with? If I have a collaborator here, do they have the skills? If they don't have the skills, but let's say they have the patients that I want, can I help them acquire the skills? How can we work together? Is there someone else who can do it? So I think I would approach it the same way I would. I'm in New York. I'm going to go to Chicago. I need to go to Chicago. Or let's say I need to go home to Milwaukee. I don't know anybody in Milwaukee too much right now. But, you know, who could help me there? If they don't have the skills, how can I get the training? If they don't have the equipment, how do I get the equipment? And you have to kind of think long term too, right? Because you don't have all of the extra things you think you might have there. That's one of the things I know many people here can attest to, that sometimes you may have the PI or whatever, but they may not, maybe they've trained here, and this is one of the things that we've looked at, and at the ASTMH we've had some meetings on, is if you, quote, go back, or you go there, what are all the ancillary things that may just be part of the norm here that you need? So I think it takes long-term strategies. I would also say to start simple and then build up, because you really need to get to know people. I know when I first went to Ghana and started the relationship there, even though I was being introduced by a wonderful colleague, you know, I had to go. I had to spend some time. You have to get to know people. You have to get to know the structure. You have to get to know how do they do things. And then you have to work to change the things that may not work. Because very small things, just like here, very small things can ruin a project if they're not being done right. So I think it does take some time. It does take some time.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Other thoughts? Anything online?
There are over 80 participants, but no open questions.
No questions. I see a couple questions here.
Well, I wanted to ask you one other thing, which is I wanted to ask you if you have advice for teachers about how to like be vulnerable in class. And I'll give you an example. I was giving a lecture, and in the year previous, I had a picture, a black and white picture of somebody with a tropical disease. And in the moment, I thought, gosh, next year I should replace that picture. And the next year when I went to give the lecture, I had not yet replaced it. And so then in class, you have this, I think your pause as a possibility is a real good example. But you know, you have the option of, I can try to breeze through it and pretend nobody noticed, or I could address it. And in that example, I addressed it. But there's a lot of competing pressures, and you know, sometimes it could be a flashpoint. Sometimes being vulnerable could engender more trust with your students, and sometimes it could lead to other things that. And so I'm just wondering if you have any advice in general about, you know, how to approach.
So it was a slide that you felt was problematic.
Yeah, one of the things I've done in our teaching is to like remove any old-fashioned looking slides and use color contemporary pictures for like, you know, teaching about tropical medicine. But that's been a process, right? And that's just one example. There could be many different kind of situations a person can find themselves in.
I think the way I would look at it is, forget the issue of vulnerability or not, what's the right thing? And so I would say, you know, I'm showing the slide, I realize that that's not the slide I want to say. You know, I say, you know, I'm really sorry. I think it would be much better to have a color picture. I had intended to get one, but this is the one that I have. I'd be happy to share a color one with anyone later. I can, you know, send one out. But I think that signals that you recognize that and you respect them. And I think that can never be the wrong answer, even if somebody objects. The example I'll give is recently I was talking to some students and they were all upset about something. And I said, you know, we're talking a lot. I said, but you need to know I'm only human. I will disappoint you, but I'm going to keep speaking with you. And so it's like that. So I think the best teaching is a dialogue where you learn from them, they learn from you. And as my father used to say, you hope that they all go on and do better than you've ever done, and then that means you were a really good teacher. So then they'll know better. You had a question, and then there'll be one in the back. Yeah.
Good.
No, it's just a quick response to Sean, which is, so I teach a class on APOL1 and parasitology and sort of the story about how that has ended up becoming a kidney disease paradigm. And I start that lecture with a slide that says we're going to be talking about the social construct of race. We're going to be talking about biological ancestry. We're going to be talking about all of these things, and we need to remember that we're talking about each other, and that, you know, we're talking about patients, we're talking about people's families in the rooms. And so if anyone feels uncomfortable or if it gets weird, like when you're, you know, just a way to kind of remind students, like, when we're talking about this, we're talking about someone's dad or someone's mom, and so we need to not be quite so like clinical and weird. I think it really helps. You can try that. So.
The picture was a black and white picture. That's what I thought it was. Or was it something different?
No, yeah, I mean, I think that was the example, was like...
Yeah, yeah. But I like what you said, because that's true. You never know what the person's experience is that's in the room, you know, and sometimes things will come up, and one person will be traumatized about it, and they're not thinking about what's happening to the other person. I have had times where other people were traumatized for other people, and the person who they thought was traumatized said, you know, hey, I didn't even miss that. So it can be an interesting world. You had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask sort of about talking about the importance of neglected diseases, particularly in the U.S. I mean, thinking about leishmaniasis and now malaria again. You know, and trying to sell the relevance of these diseases, if you will. I have worried about not, you know, demonizing particularly immigrant or migrant refugee populations. And so how do you sort of balance selling the importance of investing, particularly for funding bodies, in neglected diseases, ones that may be endemic to the U.S., although frequently rare, but make it relevant to U.S. funding bodies, and then also talk about who's at risk without sort of falling into a trap of either, you know, with those, you know, civil war encampments or now, you know, migrant crises, without sort of demonizing a group as being, you know, disease laden.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the right answer is, or the way I would look at it is, you know, that's kind of a false narrative that it has anything to do with them. I mean, heck, I go to Ghana, I stay there for months, I could come back, I could bring the bloody thing here. I mean, we have Anopheles mosquitoes. We didn't get rid of it until the 1940s, right? You know, the CDC was founded on getting rid of it. So if you come here and you have, you know, sexual stages in your blood, you can have local transmission, period. We have climate change. Things are happening with mosquitoes. The concern about leishmaniasis, yeah, we have a heck of a lot of things going on. It's not just here. I mean, you know, in other parts of the world, they're having malaria kind of march north, and then even finding it at higher elevations. You know, it used to be, you know, drain the swamps and go up high and you're okay. Well, maybe not. So I think that to put it in that perspective and to say, you know, hey, it's not just immigrant people. And then to remember, too, you can give good examples of that. I mean, in the Caribbean, you know, where they work really hard because of the tourism industry, they'll have, you know, reintroduction. They go in there and they do something about it right away. So I think that staying ahead and raising the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be an immigrant person, and that it's a multifactorial problem, and that we just have to recognize that with climate change we need to take care of the earth, consider that part of our community, and at the same time recognize that these diseases will come, and they've been here before. That's how I would look at it. Yeah?
There's time for one more question. You have a rich experience with collaborating with international collaborators, and unfortunately it's always an unequal colonialistic sort of thing where you're bringing an NIH grant or NSF or whatever, and everybody's glad to get the money and so on, but you're never on equal footing with your international partners. So I'm wondering what kind of structural things you assemble to try and avoid colonialism in global health.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, and just for anybody who doesn't know, no matter what you do, the way things are structured is you will get more money if you're from here, because the indirects are very different. So that we get much more here, and it's I've had those discussions with people at the NIH, because the way the Congress set it up is that, let's say if I get a grant or anyone here gets a grant, the way they fund the infrastructure for our institutions is by giving us this overhead. So we'll get this higher overhead, like 69%. So for every dollar, I get 69 cents. If I'm in Ghana, I get 8 cents. And then they even fix that, so it's actually less than 8 cents. So they don't have the same ability to build the infrastructure. And Congress, you know, the way they looked at it was, well, that country should build their infrastructure. You know, so that is part of the unfairness that's built in, no matter how much you try to collaborate. There are different ways as far as recognizing that and looking at, you know, how do you make sure that people have the funds that they need to repair the grants, repair machinery? How do you look for extra grants to try to make up for that? But it's a struggle. because that's a lot of money. And you can't, or it's a lot of things, and how do you give the money that helps build that kind of infrastructure? So it's hard, and I don't know the full answer, particularly now as we go in. I know you can only try to treat people with dignity, respect, and acknowledge it, and say, yeah, you're right. And then the other thing I think is to, without taking over from anybody else, is to try to help with some of the burden of the things that you can, as far as some of the paperwork and the things like that, because you'll have more money. At the same time, there are things that have to come from that institution. And then I think helping to make sure that they're have access and privy to the training possibilities that they have. You know, a lot of things are now so that they're administrators and things like that. They are available to people that are in country. I think that the move also by some of the larger private fundings and even some of the US funders to try to do things in country may help. My fear is that they need to make sure that they give people the training that they need in order to comply with all the different regulations. Otherwise, what will happen is they'll give all the money, things won't be quite right, because as everybody here knows, it's not trivial to comply with all of that. And then they'll say something which will be in that colonialist mindset, oh, those people don't know what they're doing. But how would you know, right? So I'm hoping that in all that the rollouts will be, involve that training and that we can really fight for that. But it is inherently unequal. And then trying to rethink, and I know there are a lot of smart minds out there, how could we redo those paradigms so it is fair? What is the best way to try to make sure that their infrastructure is good and our infrastructure is good? And what are the ways we can talk about that? So, good question. Thank you. Any other questions?
We're all over time, so thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you so much. I've just loved it. Thank you.